if you look at a map today in Europe, there's a really interesting fact that may surprise you. The green is Russia. Okay? It's the largest country in the world. Over here are the Baltic nations. And over here is a place called Kaliningrad. It's actually Russian. Okay? So the question then is, how did this come to pass? How was it that you've got this colony of Russians far away from the motherland? And the answer is this, because historically, this was not Russian. Historically, this was a place called Königsberg, which was part of a nation that no longer exists called Prussia. And for a couple hundred years, Prussia was the strongest military, the most advanced civilization in the world. And now it's disappeared. And it's been replaced by Poland, okay, and parts of Belarus. And West Prussia has now become part of Germany, okay? But Prussia is no longer, it's extinct. And the reason why is that in World War II, the Allies who won the war, the Soviet Union, the British, and the Americans decided to destroy Prussia. And the rationale was that Prussia is a militaristic society that is hell-bent on world domination. And by eliminating Prussia, we can now bring peace to the world. The problem, though, is that Königsberg, which is now Kaliningrad, was really the center of civilization for a few decades. This is Königsberg before in the 1800s. As you can see, it's a beautiful port city by the Baltic Sea. And it was really the apex of human civilization. And then, of course, World War II happened. And then, after World War II, Königsberg was destroyed. Okay, it was turned into rubble. And today, it's like this, Kaliningrad, okay? A very Soviet, stale city with no character, with no culture, with no civilization. All right, and that's the intent, to destroy Königsberg, which was for the longest time the heart and soul of German civilization. It is true that Königsberg and Prussia were extremely powerful, was an extremely powerful military nation. And as you can see, this is from Wikipedia, by the way, okay? As you can see, there are many great generals and officers who are from Königsberg, okay? We're talking about the city. We're not talking about the nation, Prussia. We're just talking about the city of Königsberg. But you also see that there are many intellectuals, writers, who come from Königsberg, okay? And the most famous of these intellectuals is Immanuel Kant, who we'll discuss next class. He basically changed the course of Western history with his philosophy. So Königsberg was the birthplace of Immanuel Kant. So how is it that the man who is most responsible for the Enlightenment happens to be born in a militaristic nation? Okay, that's a question. But not only Immanuel Kant, but you have also many other great thinkers, including Hannah Arendt, who is a Jewish philosopher and who is considered one of the greatest political philosophers of the 20th century. She's also from Königsberg. Scientists, just an amazing group of scientists, as well as mathematicians, okay? And then, of course, you have musicians and artists. So the contribution of Königsberg to world civilization cannot be overstated. And there are quite a few Jews who lived in Königsberg. Königsberg, for the longest time, was considered one of the most tolerant cities in Germany for Jews. Let's now look at Nobel Prize winners in the sciences, physics, chemistry, and medicine. As you can see, in 1925, the majority were actually from Germany. Okay? Germany had the best scientists in the world. 1933, same thing. You got on 1950, same thing. In fact, by 1975, Germany is still dominant. The United States is catching up. It's only by about 2000 when the United States starts to overtake Germany. So again, the question then is, how is it possible for a militaristic nation hell-bent on world domination, how are they able to produce so many great scientists, so many great philosophers? And this is a very famous quote from Voltaire that captures the prejudice of the West against Prussia. Where some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state. Okay? This is pretty insulting to Prussian culture. We've looked at many civilizations that are militaristic, okay? Including the Romans, Spartans, Aztecs, Macedonians, and Qing Chinese, among others. They're extremely successful militarily, but guess what? They were not creative. In fact, they were anti-creative. So how is it possible for the Prussians to be both creative and militaristic? And the answer is because the Western prejudice against Prussia is wrong. They were not a militaristic nation bent on world domination. They were first and foremost a creative, humanistic society that was forced into military confrontation with its neighbors because of its geographic location. Okay? So let's go back to the history of the Holy Roman Empire. As we discussed in a previous class, the Holy Roman Empire was a confederation of German city-states. And there were like thousands and thousands of them that were in competition with each other. Okay? Over time, because of competition from the more powerful states like France, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Sweden, these city-states were now forced to gel together. The most successful of these city-states is Prussia. Okay? And for the longest time, Prussia was a vassal state of the Polish Lithuania Commonwealth or the Swedes. Okay? But by about the year 1700, it started to come into its own through the leadership, through great military leadership. Okay? And it started to spread out. And as you can see, it's spreading out really quickly because of its military victories and because of its high culture. By the 19th century, Prussia has dedicated itself to uniting all of Germany. And it starts a series of wars that allow for the unification of all the German people. The first is something called the Dano-Prussian War. Then they fight against the Austrian-Hungary Empire, which is a successor to the Holy Roman Empire. And they defeat the Austrians really quickly. Then they move on to France, which is the dominant power of this time. And they defeat France, thus allowing for the complete unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. Okay, so how was Prussia able to be so successful? Well, as we discussed last class, there are certain characteristics about these city-states that go on to unify a nation. Okay, and the three major ones that Moscow and Prussia share is open cooperative competition. They're surrounded by enemies and they're forced to be innovative, open, and tolerant in order to succeed. They're forced to be unified. Advantaged by disadvantage, okay? So Prussia and Moscow had limited resources, which forces them to focus on human capital, on making sure the citizens were well educated and the citizens were hardworking and vassalage, okay? So again, Moscow was under the vassalage of the Mongols, and Prussia for the longest time was under the vassalage of the Swedes, the Poles, the Lithuanians, and as a result, they're always engaged in a process of reflection and resilience, okay? And that's really the secret to the success of Prussia. All right, at the same time, the thing to remember about the Prussians that differentiates them from the Muscovites is because Prussia is situated within Europe, it has a very different attitude towards humans than the Muscovites, okay? The Muscovites, because of their Mongolian heritage, they tend to oppress their subjects, whereas the Prussians are much more democratic, they're much more progressive, they're much more open, okay? So this is Frederick the Great, who is considered the great nation builder of Prussia through his military victories. What is often ignored is his social, economic, political reforms. He really is the first Enlightenment despot. Okay? He's heavily influenced by Immanuel Kant, They thought very highly of each other. And he was very intent on making Prussia the first enlightened state of Europe. Okay, so let's look at the few things he did. He radically reformed the Prussian judicial system so that you had rule of law, so that everyone had recourse to justice. No matter, even if you were poor, you could still sue. He abolished torture in the military. And this was revolutionary at this time because it was always assumed that you kept your soldiers in check by scaring them. Okay? He established religious tolerance. Remember, at this time in Europe, there's a huge war going on between the Catholics and the Protestants, and he was tolerant towards both the Catholics and the Protestants, and even to a certain extent to the Jews as well. Okay, and over time, Königsberg, which is the heart and center of the Prussian nation, becomes really It has one of the largest Jewish settlements in Europe. Okay, about 5,000 at that point. He grants basic form of freedom of speech. And the most important thing is that in 1763, he establishes a public school system that becomes a source for Prussia's future greatness. And to put this in context, okay, it's only over 100 years later when Britain and France does this. Japan and America will copy, just basically steal the Prussian education system, okay? In 1806, Prussia is defeated by Napoleon. Okay, we discussed this. And as a result, Prussia becomes a vassal state to Napoleon. And at this point, what the Prussians do is what they've always done, which is engage in a deep process of reflection. And they decide that in order to defeat France, they must be like France. Remember, this is the French Revolution, and there's a spread of liberalism throughout France because of the revolution. So the Prussians decide to copy the most important reforms of the French Revolution, which include the abolishment of serfdom. Now, peasants can become landowners. They destroy monopolies to encourage free market competition. They open civil service to the middle class before it's only available to the nobility. And the most important thing is the reforms of a man named William von Humboldt. He creates the modern research university. So he founded something called the Berlin University. And so he conceptualized the research university where before you sat in class and you listened to lectures and you memorized what the professor told you, but now you're encouraged to do your own research, to write a thesis, okay, which is what we do today. The most important reform he did was to conceptualize public education as a meritocracy, as an opportunity for the middle class to grow, okay, to grow the middle class and to give the middle class a greater economic role in society. And these reforms, in only a few years, will allow Prussia to defeat Napoleon and establish itself as a great power again. So, let's go back to the beginning. We were talking about Kaliningrad, right? It is one of the greatest injustices in human history that Königsberg, which was, for the longest time, the cradle of human civilization, the epicenter of the Enlightenment, it is now completely destroyed, okay? And this is this is an idea from Wagner, okay? By destroying this, the world has cursed itself, okay? Let me explain why. First of all, the German question now is more relevant than ever before. You've destroyed Königsberg, but you have not destroyed the desire for unity among the German people. Okay? So this is the memory that will not fade. Okay? So will the Germans seek vengeance? Will another Hitler arise to unite the German people? Now, what you guys don't know is that the Prussians were one of the main forces opposing Hitler as well as inhibiting Hitler. Okay? Because Prussia had a very proud culture, and it's very the strongest part of Germany. But now that they destroyed Prussia, if another Hitler arises, there's really nothing to stop him. Okay? That's the first problem. Second question is, okay, let's go back to this map. Europe and Russia are about to go to war with each other, right? Okay, well, if you are Europe and you go into Ukraine, you're going to be slaughtered, okay? But this is Kaliningrad, Russian territory, 500,000 Russians, right? You can blockade Kaliningrad. You understand? So this could be the start of World War III, right here. Does that make sense to you guys? The Europeans blockade Kaliningrad and they try to starve the people. Putin would have no choice but to intervene. Okay? But the main problem is this. Königsberg was one of the main intellectual, scientific, and cultural centers of Europe. That its loss reduced the innovative potential of humanity. All right? So what I will show you in next class when we discuss Kant is science comes from philosophy. Okay? Culture leads to philosophy, which leads to science, which leads to technology. You cannot have science independent of philosophy. When you destroy a center of philosophical innovation, you destroy a center for scientific progress. Okay? So this is something that we will discuss in depth next class.